You've seen her face 1,000 times. The red bandana, the rolled-up sleeve, the flexed bicep. "We can do it," she declares, with confident determination. Rosie the Riveter, the ultimate symbol of female empowerment, the icon that launched 1 million feminist movements. But what if I told you that behind this empowering image lies one of the most calculated betrayals in American history? What if the same government that celebrated these women as heroes systematically destroyed their lives just 3 years later? This is the story they don't teach in history class. The story of how 2 million American women were forcibly removed from their jobs, stripped of their economic independence, and erased from the narrative they helped create. This is the dark secret of Rosie the Riveter. Before we dive into this forgotten tragedy, let me be clear. This isn't about diminishing what these women accomplished. It's about exposing what was taken from them. Because the real scandal isn't just that they were fired, it's that we've been celebrating a lie for 80 years. My name is Your Channel Name, and today we're uncovering the economic catastrophe that followed World War II, a tragedy that affected millions of American families but has been whitewashed from our collective memory. We're going to follow the money, examine the government documents, and hear from the women who lived through it. By the end of this video, you'll never look at that iconic poster the same way again. So let's start at the beginning. December 1941. Pearl Harbor has just been attacked, and America is thrust into World War II overnight. Within months, 16 million American men are shipped overseas to fight. The factories that had been producing cars and refrigerators now need to produce tanks, planes, and ammunition. There's just one problem. Who's going to build them? The answer seemed obvious. Women. Millions of women who had been told their entire lives that their place was in the home were suddenly being recruited, persuaded, and yes, propagandized into joining the workforce. And that's where our story really begins. The propaganda campaign was unprecedented. The United States government, in partnership with private corporations, launched what historians now call one of the most successful social engineering projects in American history. Posters appeared everywhere. "Women in the war, we can't win without them. Do the job he left behind." Newspapers ran stories about glamorous women trading their aprons for welding torches. Hollywood stars like Rita Hayworth posed in factory settings. The message was clear and urgent. Your country needs you. And it worked. Between 1940 and 1945, the number of employed women in the United States increased by 57%. We're talking about 6 million women entering the workforce. 6 million! Many had never worked outside the home before. Many had never earned their own paycheck. But here's what made this different from just another wartime recruitment drive. These weren't volunteer positions or temporary charity work. These were real jobs with real paychecks in heavy industry. Women were building bombers, welding ships, manufacturing ammunition, operating cranes, and working in positions that had been exclusively male for generations. Take the Boeing aircraft plant in Seattle. Before the war, women made up less than 1% of the workforce. By 1944, women were 47% of all employees. At the Ford Motor Company's Willow Run plant in Michigan, which produced B-24 bombers, women comprised 40% of the workforce at peak production. And they weren't just assembling small parts. Women were doing precision welding, riveting, operating heavy machinery, reading complex technical blueprints, and working with dangerous materials. The jobs required skill, training, and physical endurance. The training programs were extensive. Women attended courses in welding, sheet metal work, blueprint reading, and machine operation. The government funded these programs through the Engineering, Science, and Management War Training Program. Over 300,000 women received technical training in skills that had previously been gatekept by male-only unions and apprenticeships. Here's something crucial to understand. These women were good at their jobs. Production records from the war years show that female workers matched and sometimes exceeded the productivity of their male predecessors. Quality control reports indicated that work done by women was equal to or better than comparable work done by men. And they were paid. Not equally, we need to be clear about that. Women typically earned about 60% of what men earned for the same work. But even with this wage gap, for millions of women, this was the first time in their lives they had economic independence. Their own bank accounts, their own money, the ability to make their own financial decisions. Think about what that meant in 1943. A woman could buy a car without her husband's permission. She could rent an apartment in her own name. She could save money for her own future. She could support her children if she was widowed or divorced. The economic autonomy was revolutionary. Women began to taste something that had been denied to them for generations. Choice. The choice to work. The choice to be financially independent. The choice to define themselves by something other than their relationships to men. And many of them loved it. Oral histories from this period reveal that for countless women, their war work years were the most fulfilling of their entire lives. They felt useful, skilled, valued, and independent. One woman, interviewed decades later, said, "For the first time in my life, I felt like I mattered. Not as somebody's wife or somebody's mother, as me, as a person who could do something important." But there was something these women didn't know. Something the government wasn't telling them. All of this, the recruitment, the training, the empowerment, the economic freedom, it came with an expiration date. Here's where the story gets dark. Because while the government was telling women we need you and you're essential to the war effort, behind closed doors, they were already planning to get rid of them. Declassified documents from the War Manpower Commission, discovered by historians in the 1980s, reveal that as early as 1943, 2 years before the war ended, government officials and corporate leaders were holding meetings about the problem of what to do with female workers once the men came home. Let me repeat that. In 1943, while women were being told they were vital, irreplaceable, and patriotic, the government was already strategizing how to remove them from the workforce. The War Manpower Commission produced internal memos discussing the need to transition women back to domestic roles and ensure jobs for returning veterans. One memo explicitly stated it must be made clear that women's employment is a temporary wartime measure. But here's the thing. They never made it clear to the women actually doing the work. The propaganda continued. The "we can do it" posters stayed up. The newspapers kept running stories about heroic female workers. Women kept being recruited, kept being trained, kept being told they were essential. Why? Because the government needed them until they didn't. Production couldn't slow down. The war had to be won. So they kept the truth hidden until the moment they no longer needed female labor. This is what makes it a betrayal. Not just that women were eventually let go, but that they were deliberately deceived about the temporary nature of their employment. They were led to believe, through years of propaganda and empty promises, that they were building careers, not just filling in. Many women made major life decisions based on this employment. Single mothers rearranged their entire lives around factory shifts. Wives delayed having children because they had careers. Women invested in training and education, believing they were building a future. Some women, emboldened by their economic independence, left bad marriages. Some moved to new cities for better job opportunities. Some bought homes in their own names. They made choices that only made sense if the work was permanent. The government knew this. Corporate leaders knew this. But they said nothing. Instead, they began preparing for what they internally called reconversion. That's the sanitized term they used, reconversion. Like women were products being converted back to their original specifications, not human beings whose lives were about to be upended. In 1944, the War Production Board began holding secret meetings with major corporations. Boeing, Ford, General Motors, General Electric, they all sent representatives. The agenda was clear. How do we remove women from the workforce as quickly as possible once the war ends? The solution they developed was systematic and ruthless. First, they would use the leverage of government defense contracts. Companies that wanted to continue receiving government business would need to prioritize hiring male veterans. Second, they would work with unions, who were eager to protect their male membership. Third, they would launch a new propaganda campaign, this time convincing women that their patriotic duty was to return home. But here's the thing. They knew this wouldn't be enough, because by 1945, surveys showed that 75 to 80% of women working in war industries wanted to keep working after the war. They liked their jobs. They needed the income. They had tasted independence and didn't want to give it up. So the plan included a fourth element, force. Women who refused to leave would be fired, not laid off with severance, not given alternative positions, fired. Terminated for cause, ineligible for unemployment benefits. This was the trap. Women had been lured into the workforce with promises of patriotism and empowerment. They had been trained, had proven themselves, had built their lives around these jobs. And now, with no warning and no alternatives, they were going to be discarded. August 15, 1945, Japan surrenders, World War II is over. The celebrations begin, and for 2 million American women, the nightmare is about to start. It happened fast, shockingly fast. Within 2 months of Japan's surrender, 1 million women were removed from manufacturing jobs. By the end of 1946, 2 million women had been forced out of industrial work. The termination notices were blunt. Your services are no longer required. Effective immediately. Position eliminated. Many women received less than 24 hours' notice. Some were told at the end of their shift not to come back. At the Ford Willow Run plant, where women had comprised 40% of the workforce, female employees were given 1 week's notice of mass terminations. No severance. No assistance finding other work, just goodbye and thank you for winning the war. But here's what makes this particularly cruel. It wasn't that the jobs disappeared. The jobs still existed. They were just being given to men. Returning veterans were given priority placement under the GI Bill and other veterans' preference laws. This sounds reasonable on the surface. Take care of the men who fought for their country. But the implementation was brutal for women. Women with years of experience, with perfect safety records, with commendations for quality work, were being replaced by men with no factory experience at all. Women who had trained male supervisors were now being supervised by those same men, or more often, just fired to make room. One woman who worked at Boeing told an interviewer, "I had 3 years of experience on the assembly line. I could read blueprints, do precision riveting, operate machinery. They fired me and hired a veteran who had never set foot in a factory. When I asked why, they told me he needed the job more because he had a family to support. I had 2 kids." The unions, which had grudgingly accepted women during wartime, now actively participated in pushing them out. Union contracts were renegotiated to include language about protecting jobs for breadwinners, which was code for men. Seniority systems, which should have protected women who had been working for years, were suddenly reinterpreted to give veterans priority regardless of actual seniority. Women who tried to fight back found every door closed. File a complaint, human resources would tell them the decision was final.
Contact the union? The union would say they were following the contract. Seek legal recourse? There were no laws against sex discrimination in employment. That wouldn't exist for another 19 years. Some women were offered alternative positions, but let me tell you what those alternatives looked like. A woman who had been a precision welder, earning $60 a week, would be offered a job as a file clerk, earning $30 a week. A woman who had operated heavy machinery would be offered a position as a receptionist. The message was clear: take the demotion or leave entirely. Most left. They had no choice. But losing the job was just the first layer of the tragedy, because along with those jobs went everything those jobs had provided. The paycheck stopped. The economic independence evaporated. The sense of purpose disappeared. Women who had bought homes found themselves unable to make mortgage payments. Women who had left bad marriages found themselves with no choice but to go back. Women who had put their children in childcare so they could work now had no income to pay for that childcare anyway. The government's response? A new propaganda campaign, just as calculated as the one that had recruited them, but with the opposite message. Suddenly, magazines were full of articles about the importance of domesticity. The kitchen is your domain. Advertisements showed happy housewives in aprons. Radio programs promoted the joys of homemaking. The message was relentless. Real women don't work. Real women stay home. If you're not satisfied being a housewife, there's something wrong with you. But here's the thing that makes this even more insidious. It wasn't that the economy collapsed because women left the workforce. In fact, the post-war economy was booming. There was plenty of work. The issue wasn't about scarcity of jobs, it was about who was allowed to have them. Women were being told they needed to go home so veterans could work. But the unemployment rate for veterans in 1946 was less than 4%. There wasn't actually a shortage of jobs. What there was an ideological commitment to restoring the pre-war social order, where women belonged in the home and men belonged in the workplace. This wasn't about economics. It was about control. It was about putting women back in their place after they had glimpsed a different possibility. And the cruelest part? It worked. By 1950, the percentage of women in manufacturing had dropped to below pre-war levels. The brief window where women had access to well-paying industrial jobs slammed shut, and it wouldn't open again for a generation. But what happened to those 2 million women? Where did they go? What were the consequences? That's what nobody talks about. That's the part of the story that's been erased.
Let's talk about what happened to those 2 million women in the years after they were forced out. Because this isn't just a story about losing jobs. It's a story about economic devastation, mental health crisis, and a generation of women who lost a piece of themselves that they never got back. First, the economic impact. When women lost their factory jobs, most were unable to find comparable work. The women's jobs that were available, secretary, waitress, retail clerk, paid a fraction of what they'd been earning. On average, women who transitioned from manufacturing to traditional female employment saw their income drop by 50% or more. For families that had relied on that income, this was catastrophic. Remember, many of these women were the primary breadwinners, widows whose husbands had died in the war, divorcees, single mothers, women married to disabled veterans who couldn't work. When their income disappeared, poverty followed. Historical records show a spike in evictions of single-woman households in 1946 and 1947. Food bank usage increased. Applications for public assistance increased. But because this was affecting primarily women, and because the broader economy was doing well, this suffering was invisible to policymakers. Women who had bought homes during the war years lost them. Women who had been saving for education or business ventures saw those dreams evaporate. The economic independence they had fought for was gone. But the financial devastation was only part of it. The psychological impact was profound. Oral histories from this period, collected by historians in later decades, reveal a consistent pattern of what we would now recognize as depression. Women described feeling useless, trapped, like I'd lost myself. Many said the years after the war were harder than the years during it. One woman said in an interview, "During the war, I got up every morning with a purpose. I was building planes that were saving lives. I was good at my job. I mattered. After they fired me, I'd wake up and think, what's the point? Make breakfast? Claim the house? Make dinner? Go to bed? Day after day. I felt like I was disappearing." Another woman, "I kept dreaming I was back in the factory. Then I'd wake up in my kitchen and want to cry. My husband would say I should be grateful I didn't have to work anymore, but I wanted to work. I needed to work. Not just for the money, for me." But they couldn't say these things out loud. The social pressure to be happy as a housewife was immense. Women who expressed dissatisfaction were told they were being ungrateful, that they were neglecting their families, that something was psychologically wrong with them. Doctors prescribed sedatives. Valium, which would become known as Mother's Little Helper, saw its usage skyrocket in the 1950s. Women were being medicated for their sadness about a situation that was entirely rational to be sad about. Some women did try to fight back. There were small protests, scattered strikes, petition campaigns, but these were largely unsuccessful and have been forgotten by history. In Detroit, a group of women who had worked at automotive plants organized a sit-in at the United Auto Workers Union headquarters demanding their jobs back. The union had them removed by police. The newspapers barely covered it. In Seattle, women from the Boeing plant wrote letters to Eleanor Roosevelt asking for her intervention. She expressed sympathy but said there was nothing she could do. The letters are now in archives, largely unread. There was no organized women's movement at this time that could have advocated for them. The feminist activism of the suffrage era had faded. The feminist movement of the 1960s hadn't yet emerged. These women were isolated, without institutional support, without a political framework to understand what had happened to them as collective injustice rather than individual failure. And so they internalized it. They blamed themselves. They wondered what they'd done wrong. They questioned whether they'd been foolish to think they could have careers. The impact rippled through families. Children remembered their mothers as sad, frustrated, distant. Marriages suffered. Divorce rates actually increased in the late 1940s and 1950s despite the propaganda about domestic bliss. Some women found ways to cope. They threw themselves into volunteer work, community organizations, churches. They found purpose where they could, but it wasn't the same as having meaningful paid employment. Volunteer work doesn't pay the mortgage. It doesn't provide financial security. It doesn't come with the dignity of a paycheck earned through your own labor. What's particularly tragic is that many of these women lived long enough to see the feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s. They watched younger women fight for the right to work, for equal pay, for access to careers, and many felt bitter. Not at the younger women, but at the system that had taken those things away from them a generation earlier. One woman, interviewed in 1982, said, "We had it. We had the jobs, the training, the experience. We proved we could do it, and they took it away from us. When I see young women today having to fight for the same things we already won and lost, I feel like we failed them. But we didn't fail. We were betrayed." That's the word that keeps coming up in these interviews. Betrayed. Not disappointed, not unfortunate. Betrayed. Because these women had done exactly what their country asked of them. They had stepped up in a moment of crisis. They had learned new skills, worked dangerous jobs, contributed to the war effort, and in return, they were discarded the moment they were no longer needed. The economic tragedy wasn't just about the immediate loss of income, though that was devastating enough. It was about the long-term consequences.
Women who had been building careers, accumulating experience, and developing skills suddenly found themselves with a gap in their work history. Years later, when some tried to re-enter the workforce, employers looked at that gap and saw unreliable workers who had chosen to stay home. The retirement implications were significant too. Social Security calculations are based on lifetime earnings. Women who had worked for several years during the war, then been forced out, often ended up with lower Social Security payments than if they'd never worked at all, because their average earnings were calculated across years where they earned nothing. This is the forgotten economic tragedy. Not just 2 million job losses, 2 million lives derailed, 2 million futures stolen, and the impact extended to their daughters, who grew up watching their mother's frustration and learning the lesson that women's work is dispensable.
So why does this matter now? Why am I telling you this story 80 years later? Because we're still living with the consequences. Because the lies we tell ourselves about history shape the present. And because the image of Rosie the Riveter has been weaponized to obscure the truth about what actually happened. Today, Rosie the Riveter is on t-shirts, coffee mugs, protest signs. She's invoked as a symbol of women's empowerment, of breaking barriers, of we can do it. And that's not entirely wrong. Those women did break barriers. They did do extraordinary things. But when we celebrate Rosie without acknowledging what came after, we're participating in the same propaganda that was used to betray those women. We're repeating the lie that their story had a happy ending. We're using their image to sell a narrative of progress that erases their suffering. The real legacy of Rosie the Riveter isn't empowerment, it's a warning. It's a demonstration of how quickly rights and opportunities can be taken away. How the same forces that give women access to economic independence can revoke that access when it's convenient. And this pattern has repeated throughout history. Every time there's been progress for women, there's been backlash. Every time women have gained economic power, there have been systematic efforts to undermine that power. Look at the 1970s. Women fought for and won Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited employment discrimination based on sex. They fought for and won Title IX, which prohibited sex discrimination in education. They entered the workforce in unprecedented numbers. And what followed? Decades of mommy wars propaganda telling women they were harming their children by working. Corporate structures that made it nearly impossible to advance while having children. A pay gap that persists to this day. Different tactics, same goal. Keep women's economic power limited. The women of World War II never got justice. They never received apologies, they never received reparations for the wages they lost or the careers that were stolen. Most died without ever seeing their story properly told. But we can learn from what happened to them. We can recognize the pattern. We can understand that progress is never guaranteed, that rights can be taken away as easily as they're given, that propaganda works both ways. When you see that Rosie the Riveter image now, I want you to think about the real women behind it, not the sanitized, empowering version, the real, complicated, betrayed version. Women who were used by their government, who had their labor exploited, who were discarded when they were no longer useful. Think about the woman who built B-24 bombers for 3 years and then was fired to make room for a man with no experience. Think about the single mother who lost her home when her paycheck disappeared. Think about the women who spent the rest of their lives wondering what they could have been if they'd been allowed to keep working. Their story matters, not as inspiration, as evidence. Evidence that the struggle for economic equality isn't about feeling good or breaking glass ceilings. It's about power. Economic power, the power to support yourself, to make your own choices, to not be dependent on anyone else for survival. That's what those women had for a brief moment. That's what was taken from them. And that's what we're still fighting for today. So the next time someone invokes Rosie the Riveter as a symbol of how far we've come, remember, we're not as far as you think.
Remember that 2 million women had careers, had independence, had purpose, and lost it all because powerful people decided women didn't deserve those things. Remember that history doesn't move in a straight line toward progress. Remember that gains can be reversed. Remember that propaganda can make you forget what actually happened. And remember the real Rosies, not the poster, the women, the ones who were betrayed, the ones who suffered in silence, the ones whose stories we've forgotten. They deserved better. We owe them the truth. Thank you for watching. If this video changed how you think about this period of history, please share it. The real story of what happened to these women has been buried for too long. It's time to dig it up. And if you're interested in more forgotten history, more stories about how propaganda shapes our understanding of the past, subscribe to the channel. There are a lot more stories that need to be told. Until next time, question everything, especially the stories that make you feel good.